Hello, today we are going to be reading Chapter 4 of Takeout by Margaret Maron. Next day, they were no nearer an ID for the second dead man. A doctored picture of him had been released to the news media and had run on the local TV channels. So far, no one had come forward to say, "Yes, that's my neighbor, my customer, my ex-wife's uncle." Jim Lurie's hardware store thought that the unmarked key found in Matty Mouton's watch pocket was for a car or truck, but without a brand name, there was no easy way to tell the make. Another canvass of the neighborhood had added nothing of significance, but the M.E. was ready to give them a cause of death. Both died from internal bleeding, Lieutenant. A pretty heavy dose of warfarin. I've seen it before, so it was an easy call. Rat poison? Sigrid asked. Well, yes, he said, but in controlled compounds, warfarin is completely prescribed to prevent blood clots. Coumadin's is the most popular form, and I'm guessing that's what this is. I'll run a few more tests to be certain. The meth user probably would have lived he'd been clean and his internal organs hadn't already been compromised. The older guy may have already been taking it. He had a pacemaker, and that's a common drug for heart problems. If so, an overdose added to what he was already on would have pushed him right over the edge. In addition, he'd recently drunk quite a lot of gin. I'm surprised he could walk. Which box had the warfarin? We found it in both cartons. But which had more, the lasagna or the fettuccine? Sigrid could almost hear his shrug over the phone. Too much cross-contamination to say for sure. Sorry, Harold. The men's fingerprints were on both takeout cartons, which further suggested that the two had shared the food. Although their prints overlay each other, the fettuccine box was marginally cleaner, as if it had been wiped. If someone wiped that carton, that could be where the Coumadin began, right? Asked Elaine Albee in the DeVito house. But Sigrid wasn't ready to commit so quickly. It's a starting point, though. She took out the business card Ms. DeVito's attorney had given her. I'll give Mr. Edwards a call, and you two see if you can find the homeless man that Mouton dispossessed of that bench. When she finally got past his switchboard, George Edwards gave a heavy sigh of a much put upon man. Is this really necessary, Lieutenant? I'm afraid so, Mr. Edwards. Do you know if your client has a heart condition? Is that what killed Matty? Some sort of heart pills? That's what our medical examiner thinks. Silence from his end. Then, she's 82, Lieutenant, and she has a pacemaker. I don't know what medications she's on, though. He gave another long sigh. Very well. I'll clear my schedule and try to meet you at the house by noon. Bridge or ferry? Jim Lurie asked Elaine Albee when they had questioned the staff at the soup kitchen again, and learned that the man they sought, a man called Lunk, was now living in a halfway house on Staten Island. Elaine had looked up the address. The halfway house was only a few blocks from the ferry landing. It was a beautiful spring day, so they wouldn't really need a car. Ferry, she said. He grinned. I'll buy you lunch. Sauerkraut or onions? Big spender, she teased, happy that their relationship had eased into something smoother now that they had gotten over that rough patch. He had come on so strongly when they were first partnered that she had instinctively backed off, knowing the dangers of hooking up with a coworker. She'd had no intention of short-circuiting her career for a quick fling. Besides, he wasn't her type. Too confident, too handsome, too sure that she would fall into his arms and into his bed. She had clamped down so hard on his overtures that when Dottie Vargas, a forthright brunette from the Bronx, and one of their crime scene officers started flirting with him last year, he had responded. Elaine had told herself that she wasn't jealous, that there was nothing to be jealous about. He wasn't her personal property. But Vargas went through men quicker than a hay fever sufferer goes through Kleenex, and Jim had grown up on a Pennsylvania apple farm, which in her eyes made him a babe in New York's woods. She'd kept her mouth shut, though, and to her relief, the flirtation seemed to have died a natural death, with no wounded feelings on either side. Hot dogs were perfect for lunching on the ferry, and when they found a place near the stern and out of the wind, where they could comfortably watch the buildings of Manhattan recede in the distance. A nearby group of tourists with several children were also munching on hot dogs, and the tang of sauerkraut and onions mingled with the smell of salt water. Soon the children were tossing the ends of their buns over the railing, and raucous seagulls dived for them, their white wings flashing in the late morning sun as they passed the Statue of Liberty. At the halfway house, a grandmotherly white woman pushed back the glass panel that separated her cubicle from the lobby. "May I help you?" Her brow furrowed when they showed her their badges and asked to speak to someone named Lunk. 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 She leaned forward to call to some men standing by the front door. "Any of you guys know somebody named Lunk?" "Yeah," said one of them. "I think his last name's Church." A few clicks of her computer, and the woman said, "Here he is. Of course. Lawrence Church. According to his schedule, he's probably up on the roof weeding our vegetable garden." They found him gazing out over the bay with a trowel in his hand. A stocky black man with bunched shoulders. He gave them a gap-toothed smile as they approached, and gestured with his trowel to the row of planter boxes. Two of the boxes looked like leafy salad bowls. The rest contained 10-inch high bright green plants. "Ain't this something? Born on a farm in Alabama, and here I am raising lettuce and tomatoes again, on a rooftop in New York City." "Mr. Church?" asked Lowry. "Lunk Church?" "Lawrence Church," he said. "I'm Lawrence now. Lawrence with a U. Done left Lunk behind over yonder, along with the whiskey bottles and sleeping on cardboard. Actually, that's what we want to ask you about. Did you know a Matty Mouton?" "Who?" Lowry showed him a picture of the dead man that had been doctored to look as if still alive, with open eyes. Church shook his head. "Ain't nobody I know." "You sure? We heard you used to bed down on a bench near that soup kitchen on the lower end of 6th Avenue till he kicked you off." "He kicked me off?" "That's what we were told." Church turned back to the picture and studied it more closely. "Oh yeah, I sorta remember him now. Skinny little white dude. Started hanging around there about the time I heard they had a place for me here. No way he kicked me off. I was ready to split. Got me a real bed here, and they found me some part-time yard work around the neighborhood. Couldn't wait to get off the farm when I was a kid. Now I wish I could get back on one. You and Matty talk much?" Reluctantly, Church brought his attention back to the picture. "Nah, he was strung out on something. I might have let booze mess me up, but I never did no drugs. I got asthma, so I can't smoke, and I've always hated needles. How come you asking about him anyhow?" "He's dead. Looks like someone gave him some poisoned food." "No shit? He ever say who he might have pissed off?" "Nah, like I said, I only saw him." "What?" 2 times 3? People bring food while people bring food while you were sleeping there? Sometimes. When was Matty there? Oh yeah, some old woman brought us Italian right before I left. He said she knew his mother. She give you food too? Shrugged. He passed out before he could eat it all, and I didn't eat all day, so I finished it off. Guess I was lucky, huh? Lucky that it didn't have poison in it that night. In mid-morning, Sigrid gathered up several folders and went down the hall to brief her boss. One file held Matty Mouton's record, another the new one they'd begun upon his death. Yet another was a bulky brown expansion envelope held together by the thick cord that had long ago replaced the original elastic string. These were the files on Benito DeVito, which she had not yet read. The papers inside were dog-eared and beginning to yellow. Several were chipped along the edges. Last year, things had still been awkward between them, but most of that had dissipated once she first learned of Captain MacKinnon's history with her parents. Until then, she had wondered if he resented her assignment to his command. She hadn't known that he and her father had been roommates and partners when they both made detective, nor that MacKinnon and her mother had been lovers. Now she knew that her father had been as handsome and charismatic as a tall blonde Viking, and had probably cheated on her mother from the beginning. But when the Leaf Herald caught a bullet from the low-level mobster, a guilt-stricken Annie had blamed MacKinnon and cut him out of her life. Somehow Sigrid's grief and near breakdown after Newman's death had brought Anne and MacKinnon back together. Night before last, her mother had let slip that she and MacKinnon planned to marry when he retired at the end of the year. "Don't tell him I told you," Anne said, as if she and MacKinnon had kept each other at arm's length after he and Anne began seeing each other. No way would either of them want it gossiped about the department or have to endure snickers about Mac becoming her stepfather. Built like an overgrown teddy bear, Captain MacKinnon still ran things on a trust him or bust him basis, and could appear sleepy-eyed and easygoing until faced with incompetence. That's when those sleepy brown eyes would sharpen, and underlings became abruptly aware that the muscles on his large frame had not softened. Now he listened intently as Sigrid briefed him on the 2 men found dead at the end of the street, where Benito DeVito, a mafia don, had been killed. "You okay with this?" "Okay?" she asked. From her puzzled look, he realized that she had not made the connection. "Benito DeVito," he said, a.k.a. Benny Olds. "What?" "Vito means old in Italian." Several years ago, once she had joined the force and had access to its record, Sigrid had read the official reports of Leaf Herald's death in the line of duty, but she had concentrated on her father's shooter, not on the shooter's connection to the mob. There had been mention that he was part of the Benny Olds organization, and she had let herself be distracted by the nickname and how he passed out Oldsmobiles like Christmas bonuses. Even though MacKinnon might have mentioned the Don's real name when he told her how Leaf had been shot, it had not registered deeply enough for her to recognize it again. MacKinnon reached for Matty Mouton's folder and gave it a quick scan. "Doesn't look as if this guy was ever really in the life, does it?" No, Sigrid said, dismayed by the anger and sadness that suddenly enveloped her as she considered the ramifications of how this case connected to her father's death. When I read the records, there was nothing to show that Olds' shooters were ever found or charged. Why? We heard it was the Gambinos, but no names surfaced, and back then, nobody looked very hard to find a killer's killer. MacKinnon gave a weary sigh. Benny Olds was a career criminal and one of the important bosses, Sigrid, but he didn't put out a hit on your dad. Ganini Gold was just a bagman, one of many foot soldiers. He shouldn't even have been carrying a gun, but it made him feel big and he popped off when Leaf laughed at him, disrespected him. What about George Edwards? Who? He asked absently, paging through the Don's bulging folder, pausing at a report here, thumbing through an old black and white pictures there. Ms. DeVito's attorney. He showed up at the house when we went to question her. She must have called him as soon as she heard that her godson's body had been found. MacKinnon shook his head. Never heard of him. I think she cut all ties to Benny's associates after he was killed. Her people came from northern Italy, so she wasn't one of those Sicilian matriarchs. No? Sigurd thought about the woman's regal air and expectation of deference. He turned over a small 3x5 photo that had slipped down into one of the dividers. Benny always had an eye for blondes. Sigurd reached for the picture. Is that Ms. DeVito? Even with that dated hairdo, she had been a knockout. Her hair was just a little too blonde, though, as if it had been helped along by a good hairdresser. Cuddled next to her handsome husband, she looked straight into the camera while he gazed down at her with an indulgent smile. Don't suppose she still looks like that, said MacKinnon. Did she get fat and matronly? Actually, no, thinner, if anything. And her hair's white now. I guess they stayed married. Good little Catholic girl. Oh, yes, he had lots of women, but she must have turned a blind eye to them. Besides, they never lasted. Benny was old school that way, kept the two parts of his life well separated. She was his wife, the mother of his daughter, and he kept her out of the criminal part of his life. Never let it touch them. Except for the dirty money. Most money is, he said with a cynical smile. There was a tap on his open door, and a uniformed officer said, Lieutenant, there's a George Edwards downstairs to see you. Really? Show him up to my office, she said, and shrugged when MacKinnon gave her a quizzical look. We were supposed to meet at the DeVito house. As long as I was coming into town, I thought we could clear the air before you speak to Sophia again, said the attorney, settling heavily into the chair across from her, with his elbows on the wooden armrests. Despite the acne scars and wary eyes, there was something appealing about his smile. He probably did very well with juries, Sigrid thought. You don't practice here in town, she asked. Riverhead. I'm surprised Miss DeVito wouldn't want her lawyer nearer to hand. Because of her husband's reputation? An amused smile spread across the attorney's broad, pockmarked face. He died years ago, Lieutenant. Besides, my practice is mostly wills and trusts. Yet you came running as soon as you heard Matty Mouton was dead. Sophia's his godmother, and I'm her son-in-law. Of course I came. You, but not her daughter. All amusement faded from the man's face. What exactly is it that you need to know about Matty? What was his relationship to Miss DeVito? It wasn't much of a relationship these days. Orla said she told you how Sophia still saw that he had a good meal once a week. Sigrid nodded. His mother was Benny's cousin, and she introduced him to Sophia. Matty was a sweet kid, weak but sweet. He and my wife used to be close till he got into drugs. He was like a brother to her when they were growing up. Then he started using. Sophia tried everything, paid for rehab. We got him a part-time job and a place to live. She even let him drive for a couple of years. We finally thought he'd finally kicked it for good, but back in December he started using again and dived straight to the bottom. Became unreliable. At that point, Sophia pretty much washed her hands of him. She felt sorry for him, but there's been no real contact with him since. He hesitated as if catching himself. No contact since December, so I hope it won't be necessary to bother her about this again. Sigrid handed him the key Tilly had found. This was in one of his pockets. Did he have a car? Not that I ever heard. Would this key fit Mrs. DeVito's car? I doubt it. He handed those keys over to me when Sophia told me to fire him. What about Miss Orlando? Orla, what about her? How did she feel about Matty? Edwards leaned back in the chair and tented his fingers as he considered her question. She's absolutely devoted to Sophia, and she knows how much it hurt her when Matty started using again. She's not exactly mourning his death. Why? I don't have to spell it out for you, Mr. Edwards. I told you. Matty Mouton died of an overdose of a blood thinner. Your medical examiner's positive it wasn't speed. What do they call it? Crystal meth? He thinks Coumadin, so you can see why we need to question the people who provided his last meal. Coumadin, the attorney collapsed his tented fingers. I know several people who take Coumadin for their heart. I doubt if it's hard to come by. Granted, all the same, there was Coumadin in the pasta Ms. DeVito sent down to him. But there were 2 men dead on that bench, right? And Orla said there were 2 takeout cartons. Who is the other guy? Where did he get his food? We haven't identified him yet. She handed Edwards a picture of the older dead man. Recognize him? Edwards studied the second man's face for a long moment. Sorry, never seen him before. It's too soon to know precisely what happened on that bench. But there's a possibility that the men seem to have shared their food. Yeah? If indeed it is poison, and if it started out in the takeout Miss Orlando gave him, and neither she nor Miss DeVito put it there, then maybe it was meant for one or both of those women. Did they order the fettuccine from the restaurant? Who delivered it? We'll want to know who had access to it. Visitors or workmen, maybe? That's ridiculous, Edward said. Nevertheless, he stood up and flexed his shoulders to shoot the cuffs of his white shirt. Very well, I'll meet you over at the house, but I'm asking you, Lieutenant, please don't upset my mother-in-law. She's an old woman with a bad heart. She's been through a lot, and she's not as strong as she looks. We'll make it as brief as we can, Sigrid said. And that's the end of Chapter 4 of Takeout. So I will see you tomorrow for Chapter 5. Have a wonderful day.